There's a thing that happens in your brain when a movie tells you it's based on a true story. Something clicks. A little flag gets raised that says, okay, pay close attention to what you're seeing because this is real. And that tiny little flag changes everything about how you process what you're watching. But here's the problem. That flag never fully comes back down. Alan Castle, a professor at UCLA, wrote about this in Psychology Today, and it genuinely stopped me in my tracks when I first read it. He described something called the sleeper effect, which is a phenomenon where over time your brain forgets where a piece of information came from. You might remember right after watching a movie that a specific scene was dramatized or fictional, but weeks later, months later, your brain has filed that image away in the same folder as real memories. The part of your brain that remembers where you heard that information disappears, and now that fictional scene just lives in your head as a thing that happened. Castle uses a perfect example to illustrate this. Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, for example, where in this movie, Sharon Tate survives, when in reality, the story that it's based on, Sharon Tate was murdered by the Manson family in 1969.
5 persons, including actress Sharon Tate, were found dead at the home of Miss Tate and her husband.
That's documented history, that's proven. But the movie shows her alive and ultimately safe. The point here is that for younger viewers who didn't live through these events, who have no personal memory to anchor the real way these things unfolded, the movie version can quietly become our reality. And not because we as the viewers are gullible, but because that's just how human memory works. Every time you remember something, you're not playing back in your mind, your brain is rebuilding it from fragments, and those fragments can come from anywhere in your mind. A documentary, a conversation, a movie you watched on a random Tuesday night, literally wherever, your brain doesn't always keep track of which is which. And Hollywood knows this. Maybe not consciously, but the entire craft of filmmaking is built around making you feel like you are there, like you are inside of whatever story you are watching. And when something feels real, your brain treats it as real. Now, before we go any further, I want to mention something that might seem obvious, but actually isn't. We talk about movies getting history wrong, like history is this fixed, objective thing that movies are distorting on purpose. But Sabine Muller, a researcher who studies exactly this intersection of film and memory, makes an argument that genuinely changed the way I think about this entirely. Her argument is that history isn't a set of facts sitting in a vault somewhere, but rather that history is a construct. It's something we rebuild every time we engage with it. Every generation re-examines the past through its own lens, its own politics, its own fears and values, and what comes out the other end is never identical to what went in. The past doesn't change, but our understanding of it does. Constantly, which means that when a movie comes along and presents a version of history, even a dramatized, compressed, and sometimes even flat out wrong version, it's not doing something fundamentally different from what history has always done.
I give homage to Scotland.
The only difference I can think of here is emotion and scale, because a textbook can tell you that D-Day was a pivotal moment in World War II, but Saving Private Ryan can make you feel the sand and the salt water and the absolute terror of being on that beach. And according to historians quoted in a History Extra piece by Kev Locken, Saving Private Ryan is now one of the primary reasons people emotionally understand D-Day the way they do, which is kind of the power and the problem that movies have at the same time. A movie that makes you feel history is giving you something a textbook never could, but it's also handing you an emotional anchor that's attached to a version of events that someone in Hollywood made up for a big screen. Now, I want to talk about some specific examples because this is where it gets genuinely wild. Braveheart, one of the most beloved historical epics ever made. It's won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and it's Mel Gibson's magnum opus. And it is, by the assessment of multiple historians, almost comically inaccurate. The kilts are from the wrong era. The blue face paint was... yeah, we won't even get into that one. The romantic subplot involving the French princess, she would have been a child during the actual events, but again, we'll leave that alone for now. And lastly, William Wallace's execution. While real and brutal, it didn't go down the way the film depicts it. And yet, in that same History Extra article, a historian points out something quite interesting. That being that Braveheart captures something true about how Scottish people see themselves, even though it gets the surface details wrong. The emotional truth resonated so deeply that it became a defining cultural image of Scottish national identity. A movie that historians call technically wrong is now one of the main reasons Scottish independence has the cultural mythology it does today. And then we have movies like The Social Network, David Fincher's masterpiece about the founding of Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg himself has described it as inaccurate. The dramatized falling out between Zuckerberg and his co-founder Eduardo Saverin, the cold and calculating portrayal of Zuckerberg's motivation, the way certain key relationships are depicted, all contested by the people they are based after. And yet, for most people under 30, The Social Network is what they think when they think about how Facebook was built. I know I can say personally this is true for myself. After watching this movie, I hated Mark Zuckerberg for what he did, when in actuality I never really did fact check anything. In Bohemian Rhapsody, for example, Queen's fans lost their minds over the timeline being completely rearranged, events placed in the wrong order, things that happened after Freddie Mercury's diagnosis being shown as happening before it, a Live Aid performance that never actually happened the way the movie shows. But I mean, the movie made $900 million at the box office, so at least 20th Century Studios are happy. And now, an entire generation of new Queen's fans were introduced to Freddie Mercury's story through that lens. And none of this is necessarily malicious. Filmmakers compress timelines to make narratives work. That's how it's always been and how it always will be. They invent dialogue because they weren't in the room to hear those actual conversations. The only problem is when the sleeper effect kicks in 6 months later, and you can't remember whether that scene was real or fake, and you stop caring enough to check. And this is happening to you, right now, with events that are recent enough that you should still have a clear memory of them. Think about every major historical or political event you've seen depicted in a film or TV series in the last 10 years. For example, the 2008 financial crisis that we see in The Big Short, the hunt for bin Laden through Zero Dark 30, the AIDS crisis through Dallas Buyers Club or The Normal Heart, Watergate through All the President's Men, and NASA disasters through countless movies. What do you actually know about those events from primary sources? And what do you think you know that actually came from a really well-made movie with a great score and actor you liked? Be honest with yourself, because the research says most people can't clearly separate the two after enough time has passed. The sleeper effect doesn't discriminate between people who paid attention in history class and people who didn't. We are all susceptible to this. The question is just whether we know it's happening. Mahler's argument gets really interesting here because she says the solution isn't to stop watching historical films, it's to watch them differently, to treat them as what they are, which is a version of history filtered through a specific perspective at a specific cultural moment. Braveheart tells you as much about 1995 and Mel Gibson's worldview as it tells you about 13th century Scotland. The Social Network tells you as much about Silicon Valley in the 2010s as it tells you about Mark Zuckerberg. Do you see what I'm getting at here? The film is always a document of when it was made, and I don't think watching it this way ruins the movie. If anything, it makes them more interesting because now you're watching two things at once. The story the film thinks it's telling, and the story it's accidentally telling about itself. But here's the thing that I can't stop thinking about, and this is the part where it gets a little uncomfortable. We've been talking about this like it's some passive thing that happens to audiences all the time, like Hollywood makes a movie, your brain absorbs it incorrectly, and that's the chain of events. But there's a direction this goes that's much more intentional. Governments have always understood that whoever controls the story of the past controls the identity of the present. That's not a conspiracy theory, it's just how civilization has always operated. What's new here is the scale. A film released globally can deliver a single version of a historical event to hundreds of millions of people simultaneously, all experiencing the same emotional cues. You know, this being the music, the same pacing and framing of the story, stuff like that. And 6 months later, thanks to the sleeper effect, a chunk of those people will have filed that version away as memory. And what once was a form of simple entertainment is now one of the most powerful forces in the formation of collective cultural identity that has ever existed. It's more powerful than textbooks because more people watch movies than read history books. It's more emotionally resonant than documentaries because I think we all agree that a well-written narrative is much more engaging than talking headshots, and it's much more lasting than news coverage because a movie gets rewatched and referenced for decades.
Oh no, you still wired in?
Now, you may be asking yourself, what's the point of this video? And I can tell you it's not to stop watching historical movies. That would be insane and also impossible at this point because they're too good and there are far too many of them, and Saving Private Ryan exists, so we can't do that. The answer is closer to what both Mueller and Castle are pointing toward, which is just awareness. Knowing that the sleeper effect is real, and knowing that your brain will eventually stop flagging where information came from. Because here's the thing, a movie that gets the history slightly wrong can still teach you something true. Braveheart might be historically inaccurate and still correctly capture something real about national identity and resistance and the stories people need to believe about themselves to keep going. But those are two different kinds of truth, and both of them matter. You just have to know which one you're watching. Otherwise, you're walking around with someone else's version of the past sitting around in your brain. And the beautiful thing about history is that we can decide what it means for ourselves individually. Anyways, that's about it. Have an amazing day, everyone. I'm gonna go watch Saving Private Ryan now.